At Iro 700, on July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye against the periscope of USS Barb, watching a Japanese supply train snake along the Karafuto coastline, carrying troops and ammunition that would kill American soldiers if he didn't stop it. 31 years old, 5 war patrols as Barb's commander, 17 enemy ships already at the bottom. The Japanese were running trains per day along that coastal railroad, each carrying troops plus ammunition and supplies for garrisons. Fluckey had been hunting in the Sea of Okhotsk for weeks. The Gato-class submarine USS Barb displaced 2,400 tons submerged and carried a crew of 80 men. She was one of the most decorated submarines in the Pacific Fleet. 4 Presidential Unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. But what made Barb truly dangerous wasn't her awards. It was her captain. 3 months earlier, Fluckey had received the Medal of Honor. The citation described his attack on Namquan Harbor off the coast of China in January 1945. He had taken Barb into water so shallow the submarine couldn't dive. Minefields on both sides, Japanese destroyers patrolling the entrance. 30 merchant ships anchored inside, protected by what the Japanese believed was an impenetrable defensive position. Fluckey attacked anyway. 6 torpedoes into the convoy, then 4 more. Then a high-speed surface run through uncharted waters while depth charges exploded around them. At least 6 ships sunk, 0 American casualties. The brass in Pearl Harbor called it the most audacious submarine attack of the war. But Fluckey wasn't satisfied. By June 1945, Japanese merchant shipping had nearly vanished from the Pacific. American submarines were running out of targets. Before Barb's 12th and final war patrol, Fluckey approached the Navy's research and development staff with an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The Mark 51 launcher held 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, each tipped with high-explosive, maximum range about 3 miles. The Navy was testing the system as an anti-kamikaze weapon for landing ships. Fluckey convinced them to bolt one onto Barb's forward deck. It made her the only rocket-launching submarine in the United States Navy. Barb departed Midway on June 8th, loaded with rockets and orders to raise hell along the Japanese coast. She reached the waters north of Hokkaido on June 20th. 2 days later, at EO-230 on June 22nd, Fluckey surfaced 3 miles off the town of Shari, population 20,000, a factory district that produced supplies for the Japanese military. The submarine turned broadside to the shore. Fluckey gave the order. 12 rockets ripple-fired in seconds. They screamed through the darkness and slammed into Shari's industrial center. Fires erupted across the waterfront. Barb submerged and disappeared before the Japanese could respond. It was the first time in history a submarine had launched rockets against a shore target. Over the next weeks, Barb fired dozens more rockets at factory towns along the Hokkaido and Karafuto coasts. Shari, Shikuka, Kashiho, Shiritoru, Japan's largest paper mill destroyed. A leather tanning factory that made pilot uniforms burning. Small shipyards reduced to wreckage. Fluckey also used Barb's 4-inch and 5-inch deck guns to shell military installations. The submarine operated with impunity. By mid-July, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were hunting for her, but Fluckey kept moving, kept striking, kept the enemy off balance. Then, on July 19th, while patrolling off southern Karafuto, Fluckey noticed something through the periscope. A railroad ran within 400 yards of the coastline, trains moving north and south throughout the day and night. Locomotives pulling freight cars filled with troops and military cargo. The trains represented a supply line feeding Japanese forces preparing to resist an American invasion. Fluckey watched the trains for 3 days. He counted schedules. He studied the terrain. The beach was accessible, the tracks were vulnerable, and an idea began forming. The problem was obvious. Barb could surface and shell the railroad with her deck gun, but that would only damage the tracks. The Japanese would repair them within hours. What Fluckey wanted was to destroy a moving train. Maximum damage, maximum disruption, maximum psychological impact. But submarines didn't carry weapons designed for land targets. Torpedoes were useless. The rockets lacked the precision for a moving target. The deck gun couldn't track a train through coastal terrain. Fluckey needed a different solution. Something the Japanese wouldn't expect. Something no submarine had ever attempted. If you want to see how Fluckey solved this impossible problem, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Fluckey. On the evening of July 22nd, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders and Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield sat in Barb's cramped forward torpedo room with a problem. Fluckey had asked them to devise a way to blow up a train without risking a shore party during the explosion. Hatfield stared at the 55-pound scuttling charge. The device was designed to destroy Barb if the crew had to abandon her to prevent capture. Hatfield had an idea. He remembered a childhood trick, placing walnuts on railroad tracks so the weight of passing trains would crack them open. What if they could rig the scuttling charge the same way? A microswitch buried under the rails, the weight of a locomotive closing the circuit. The train would destroy itself. Fluckey examined the device Hatfield and Saunders had constructed. A simple pressure switch salvaged from submarine components. Dry cell batteries wired in series. The 55-pound scuttling charge packed with enough explosive to vaporize a locomotive. The entire assembly fit inside an empty pickle jar for waterproofing. When a train's weight depressed the rails even a quarter inch, the microswitch would complete the electrical circuit. Detonation would occur directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. Hatfield estimated the explosion would destroy the locomotive and derail the cars behind it. The engineering was sound, but the mission itself presented enormous risks. Barb would need to surface within 1,000 yards of the Japanese coastline. A shore party would paddle inflatable rafts to the beach, cross 400 yards of enemy territory, plant the explosive, and return before dawn. If Japanese patrols discovered them, the men would be trapped on hostile soil with no support and no escape route. If the submarine was spotted while surfaced in shallow water, she couldn't dive quickly enough to evade attack. Fluckey calculated they would have roughly 90 minutes. From the moment the rafts launched until Barb had to submerge, every man aboard Barb volunteered for the mission. 80 sailors raised their hands when Fluckey asked for volunteers. The commander established strict criteria. First, unmarried men only. He refused to create widows. Second, physical fitness and swimming ability. The men would be paddling through surf and might need to swim if the rafts capsized. Third, preferably former Boy Scouts. Fluckey had been a scout himself, and believed their training in navigation and emergency procedures would prove invaluable if the party got separated or lost. Fourth, a mix of skills. An electrician to wire the device, strong men to dig, and experienced sailors who could handle the rafts in darkness. Fluckey selected 8 men. Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders would lead the shore party. 26 years old, he had served aboard Barb since her commissioning in 1942. Every single war patrol, Atlantic and Pacific. Electricians. Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield would handle the explosive device. He had worked for the railroad before the war and understood track construction. Signalman 2nd Class Francis Sever. Ship's cook, 1st Class Lawrence Newland. Torpedo man's Mate 3rd Class Edward Klinglesmith. Motor machinist's mate, 2nd Class James Richard. Motor machinist's mate, 1st Class John Markison. And Lieutenant William Walker would serve as the officer in charge. The crew began preparations. Barb's engineers cut steel plates from the engine room lower flats, then bent and welded them into improvised picks and shovels for digging. The shore party would need to bury the explosive and batteries at least 6 inches beneath the railroad ties to ensure the microswitch functioned properly. The men packed survival gear in case they had to flee toward Soviet territory on the northern half of Sakhalin Island, 130 miles through mountain ranges. They also packed raw stakes. Intelligence. Reports indicated Japanese patrols used guard dogs along the coastal railroad. The stakes might buy them a few precious seconds if they encountered animals. Weather became the critical factor. Fluckey needed cloud cover to hide the 3/4 moon. Clear skies would illuminate the submarine and the rafts, making them visible to Japanese sentries. For days, Barb patrolled off Karafuto while the crew watched the sky. Clear, clear again. Fluckey grew increasingly frustrated. Only days remained in their patrol schedule. After that, Barb would need to return to Midway. The window was closing. On the afternoon of July 22nd, cirrus clouds appeared on the horizon. By evening, stratus clouds were capping the mountain peaks along the Karafuto coast. Cloud cover was building from the west. Fluckey made the decision. They would execute the mission that night. Final preparations accelerated. The shore party checked their equipment. Waterproof. Flashlights, pistols, the pickle jar containing batteries and explosives, digging tools, Mae West life vests in case they had to swim. The two rubber rafts were readied on deck. At 2300 hours on July 22nd, Barb began her approach to the Karafuto coastline. Fluckey kept the submarine on the surface, running slowly on electric motors to reduce noise. The sky cooperated. Cloud cover obscured the moon. Darkness blanketed the water. Through the periscope, Fluckey could see the railroad, running parallel to the shoreline. No lights visible on the beach. No signs of patrol activity. The conditions were as favorable as they would ever be. Barb crept to within 950 yards of the shore. The depth gauge showed only about 36 feet of water. If Japanese patrol boats appeared, the submarine would have perhaps 90 seconds to crash dive. Even then, she might hit bottom before fully submerging. Fluckey was betting everything on surprise and darkness. The 8 men assembled on deck wearing dark clothing. Saunders checked his watch. Midnight was approaching. Fluckey gave the order. The rafts went over the side. The rafts hit the water at 00:05 on July 23rd. Saunders and Walker took the lead raft with Hatfield and Sever. The second raft carried Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, and Markison. The men pushed off from Barb's hull and began paddling toward the invisible shoreline. No lights, no sound, except the dip of paddles and the whisper of water against rubber. The cloud cover held. Darkness remained absolute. Behind them, USS Barb sat low in the water, a darker shadow against the black ocean, 25 minutes to reach the beach. The men paddled steadily, maintaining formation. The surf was light, no breakers to contend with. The rafts grounded on sand at 00:30. All 8 men dragged the boats above the high tide line and secured them behind rocks and driftwood. Newland and Richard stayed with the rafts as guards. Their job was to ensure the escape route remained open and to signal Barb if Japanese patrols approached. The other 6 men moved inland. They were the first American combat troops to set foot on Japanese home island territory during the war. Karafuto was part of the Japanese prefecture system administered from Tokyo, populated by Japanese civilians and defended by Japanese military forces. Every step they took was on enemy sovereign territory. Getting caught meant execution. The Geneva Convention didn't protect saboteurs operating behind enemy lines in civilian clothes. The terrain was rougher than expected. High grass concealed uneven ground. Saver nearly twisted his ankle in a depression hidden by vegetation. They moved slowly, testing each step before committing their weight. 50 yards inland, they encountered a drainage ditch 3 feet deep, water at the bottom. The men lowered themselves into the ditch, crossed the muddy bottom, and climbed the opposite bank. Their clothing was now wet and heavy. 100 yards from the beach, they reached a packed earth road, vehicle tracks visible in the dirt. The road ran parallel to the railroad connecting coastal villages. Saunders signaled a halt. The men crouched in the grass beside the road and listened. No engine sounds, no voices, no movement. They crossed quickly, one at a time, then continued toward the railroad embankment, visible as a dark ridge against the slightly lighter sky. At 00:50, they reached the base of the railroad embankment. Walker and Saunders climbed to the tracks and examined the area. The rails ran north-south on a raised bed of gravel and crushed rock. Wooden ties spaced evenly beneath the steel rails. The position offered good visibility in both directions. Too good. If a patrol came along the tracks, the shore party would be completely exposed. They needed to work fast. But before they could begin digging, Sever grabbed Saunders' arm and pointed north. A faint vibration in the rails. Then a distant sound. A train was coming. The men dropped flat in the grass beside the embankment. Hatfield pulled the pickle jar containing the explosive device tight against his chest. The vibration grew stronger. The sound became a rhythmic chugging, a locomotive pulling freight cars through the darkness. The train appeared from the north at approximately 00:05. No headlight, complete blackout conditions. The locomotive passed. Within 15 feet of where the Americans lay hidden, steam hissing, wheels clacking over rail joints, the men could feel the ground shaking. Freight cars followed, about 16 cars. Then the train passed, continuing south. The sound faded into the distance. Saunders waited 2 full minutes after the train disappeared before giving the signal to move. The men climbed onto the embankment and took positions. Klingelsmith, Sever, and Walker spread out as sentries. Klingelsmith moved north along the tracks, 50 yards. Sever went south the same distance. Walker positioned himself where he could see both directions and watch the road they had crossed. That left Saunders, Hatfield, and Markison to dig and plant the device. Hatfield selected the location, a straight section of track where an approaching train would be traveling at maximum speed. No curves to slow it down, no grade to reduce momentum. The rails here ran level across flat ground for at least half a mile in both directions. Perfect. Hatfield knelt between the rails and examined the ties. He needed to bury the explosive directly beneath the rail where the locomotive's weight would depress it enough to trigger the microswitch. Saunders and Markison began digging with the improvised tools. The gravel came away easily at first, but 6 inches down they hit compacted earth mixed with larger rocks. The digging became harder, slower. The steel shovel scraped against stones. Each sound seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. Hatfield kept checking his watch. They had been on shore for 30 minutes. Fluckey would wait 90 minutes maximum before Barb had to dive. The clock was running. At 01:15, Sever whistled softly from his position south along the tracks. Another train was coming. The shore party dropped flat again. This train was approaching from the south, moving north, the opposite direction from the first one. Hatfield lay beside the partially excavated hole, still clutching the pickle jar. The digging tools were scattered across the gravel between the rails. If the locomotive's headlight was on, the engineer would see everything. The mission would be compromised. Japanese troops would flood the area within minutes. But like the first train, this one ran in complete darkness. No headlight. The blackout protocols the Japanese were enforcing along the coastal railroad were protecting the American saboteurs. The locomotive thundered past at 0117. Another freight train, about 14 cars this time. Hatfield counted them as they clattered overhead. The shore party remained motionless until the sound faded completely to the north. 2 trains in 22 minutes. The railroad was more active at night than Fluckey's observations had suggested. Saunders motioned the men back to work. They had less than an hour before Barb would need to submerge. Markison attacked the hole with renewed urgency. The shovel bit into the compacted earth. Rocks scraped free. Saunders used the pick to break up the harder sections. Within 15 minutes, they had excavated a space roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep directly beneath the western rail, large enough to accommodate the scuttling charge, the batteries, and the micro-switch assembly. Hatfield removed the components from the pickle jar. The 55-pound scuttling charge was a cylindrical metal canister packed with high explosive, enough power to blow a 3-foot hole in a submarine's pressure hull. Against a locomotive traveling at speed, the effect would be catastrophic. Hatfield positioned the charge at the bottom of the hole and packed dirt around it to hold it steady. Then he carefully placed the batteries beside the charge and began wiring the circuit. The microswitch was the critical component. Hatfield had designed it to close when the rail above it depressed under the locomotive's weight. Japanese locomotives typically weighed 60–80 tons. That weight distributed across the wheels would push the rail downward approximately 1 tau 4 to 1 tau 2 inch. The microswitch needed to be positioned precisely. Too deep and the rail wouldn't depress enough to trigger it. Too shallow and vibrations from normal track expansion might cause a premature detonation. Hatfield worked by touch more than sight. His waterproof flashlight provided minimal illumination directed downward into the hole to prevent the beam from being visible at a distance. He connected the positive terminal from the batteries to one side of the microswitch. The negative terminal ran to the scuttling charge detonator. The final connection from the detonator back to the microswitch would complete the circuit. But Hatfield left that wire disconnected. He would make the final connection last, just before they departed. Until then, the device was safe. At 01:35, Hatfield had the wiring completed except for the final connection. He looked at Saunders and nodded. Saunders signaled Walker. The sentries began pulling back to the worksite. Klingelsmith returned from the north, Sever from the south. Walker came up from his observation position near the road. The 6 men gathered at the tracks. Hatfield made the final connection. The circuit was now live. Any significant downward pressure on the rail above the microswitch would trigger the explosion. He covered the device carefully with dirt and gravel, smoothing it to match the surrounding ballast. No visible disturbance. A track inspector walking this section in daylight might notice the slightly disturbed gravel, but a locomotive engineer traveling at speed in darkness would see nothing unusual. The shore party moved off the railroad embankment and began working their way back toward the beach. Same route in reverse, across the road, through the drainage ditch, through the high grass. They moved faster now. The mission was complete. The explosive was armed. Every minute they remained on Japanese soil increased the risk of discovery. At 1:45, they reached the beach where Newland and Richard were waiting with the rafts. All 8 men dragged the rafts to the waterline and climbed aboard. Saunders checked the luminous dial on his watch. They had been ashore for about 1 hour and 40 minutes. Barb would be preparing to dive. The rafts pushed off from the beach, and the men began paddling toward the position where the submarine waited. The distance back to Barb was 950 yards. In calm water with experienced paddlers, that meant roughly 15 minutes. They were halfway to the submarine when Fluckey's voice cut through. The darkness. He was shouting through a megaphone from Barb's conning tower, telling them to paddle faster. Another train was coming down the tracks.